And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostick here with Katie Greifeld, taking you through to that closing bell. It's a global simulcast. Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec join us now. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, television, radio, our partnership with YouTube here, guys, on a day, Katie, where we're seeing a pretty solid rally. We're well off the highs of the day, but a little bit of conviction, a little bit of sticking to some of these numbers as we get closer to the bells.
Absolutely not the same sort of muscle behind this rally that you saw on Monday, and certainly we gave back some of those gains yesterday, but still nothing to sneeze at, Carol. The S&P 500 higher by about 0.5% right now, and you can see that really reflected across most of the major indexes.
Yeah, but you go, to the commodity markets, right? And you take a look at something like what we're seeing in the oil trade. We have seen a little bit of a pullback. We were down, though, a lot more. So again, it goes back to kind of trading and watching the headlines and really waiting for some conviction that maybe there's going to be a different outcome, maybe a ceasefire when it comes to the U.S. war in Iran. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Carol, Brent fell as low as 97.15 a barrel, now at 103, let's say. But it was down as much as 7% earlier in the session on that optimism, Romaine. But
yeah,
you have to look no further than what's happening in commodity markets to really get an understanding for how at least traders are thinking about a solution here.
Yeah, and of course, you also have to look at least when it comes to energy, those refined fuel products, day 26 of the war, and day 25, where we've seen prices at the pump rise, now up more than 30% since the war started. And of course, a lot of other commodities, including heating fuel, jet fuel for that matter, are also still elevated. And based on a conversation we had earlier on the close, not necessarily going to fall sharply anytime soon. Let's walk you through the numbers here on this Wednesday afternoon. I'm going to start with the S&P 500 because at one point on the day, it did actually trade above its 200-day moving average, but it's going to close just below it, 65.91 and change, 65.92, up about 36 points or 0.5%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average adding 300 points or 0.7%. The NASDAQ Composite up about 0.8%. The Russell 2000, that's your outperformer, once again here, adding about 31 points or 1.2%.
All right, Romaine, let's go back to the S&P 500. Most names actually higher for the trade. About 322 names, Katie, gaining on this Wednesday. 180 to the downside, one unchanged.
Yeah, you take a look at the sector level. You can see that breadth, 9 sectors of 11 in the green. What a beautiful circle we're looking at our screens. Energy is your underperformer on the day, down about 0.5%. That's your biggest loser. I believe that was your biggest winner yesterday. Your biggest winner today, though, consumer, discretionary, and then materials up at the top, higher by about 2%, Carol.
All right, let's go to individual gainers. And the number one gainer in the NASDAQ 100 and the number 3 gainer in the S&P 500, that is ARM Holdings, soaring in today's session. And we did see this one, of course, moving a lot higher. So we're talking about a 16% gain there. That's after the company will begin selling its own chips. We got this information late yesterday. It's called AGI CPU. They're going to be having Meta Platforms, their first major customer. So pretty big customer to have. ARM expecting revenue from the new chip business to generate about $15 billion annually within 5 years, and total sales to reach roughly $25 billion. So investors definitely liking that news. Then I want to go over to space and satellite companies, because as a whole, we saw this group move to the upside on the report of the SpaceX IPO filing. So you had EchoStar up about 7.5%. You had Rocket Lab up about 10%. You also had AST Space Mobile, a gain of about 10.5%. And then you had, I'm just throwing in Tesla there, since this was obviously related to this company, just up about 0.75%. But SpaceX considering a fundraising target in its IPO that would dwarf the previous largest ever debut. That's according to people familiar. And so we're talking about weighing a ballpark figure of about $75 billion in its IPO, according to those in the know. Information had also reported this earlier on this higher fundraising target. So it's really fascinating to see. But all of these companies, and let's not forget that EchoStar, it was back in September that we reported out how SpaceX was buying EchoStar Spectrum for $17 billion. But the whole space, no pun intended.
The whole space?
No pun intended. Higher. And I got to mention JetBlue. Let me just quickly go there.
Data centers.
Surging up about 13% here. JetBlue is said to be considering the option of selling itself to a competitor. Semaphore reporting this out, citing people familiar, and that the U.S. airline has hired advisors to explore the viability of a deal and is considering some scenarios of a tie-up maybe with United or Alaska. we'll see where this goes. But we know that this has certainly been a carrier that's been under pressure, losses in its last reporting. So certainly on our radar, up 13%, way off the highs of a few years ago.
Okay, but under pressure over the long term.
Yeah. Why?
Under pressure on the short term are the stocks I'm going to talk about right now.
Oh, okay, go there.
Let's talk about some of the energy and chemical stocks falling today as investors weighed Iran rejecting a U.S. ceasefire proposal. Valero among those falling 3%. Valero, though, a bit idiosyncratic due to a refinery fire this week. On that, the company is preparing to restart its Port Arthur oil refinery in Texas after shutting the plant yesterday due to a fire, Reuters reported, citing 2 unidentified people familiar with operations. Those shares today falling by about 3%. Also, among the worst performers on a percentage basis in the S&P 500, got to throw Generac Holdings in there. The company fell today as investors digested what they learned at an investor day, but off its lows of the session, down more than 6% at one point, finished the day down just shy of 2%. The company did report 2028 targets. It discussed developing partnerships with hyperscalers during its Investor Day conference. It also said it would reorganize into 2 separate reportable segments effective at the end of this month. Analysts from William Blair said that investors were disappointed with the absence of a hyperscaler agreement, though they were positive about Generac's backlog growth and guidance. And finally, let's talk shoes. On Holdings, falling more than 11% today.
Ouch.
Yeah. I'm wearing my ons, too.
No kidding.
Martin Hoffman, somebody, I know you guys have spoken to him. We've spoken to him on our program, too. He's going to step down from his role. He's the CEO. COO Scott McGuire will assume the title of president. The co-founders, Casper Capetti and David Alleman, will take over as co-CEOs in May. The decision designed to preserve On's, quote, entrepreneurial speed. It was made mutually. That's according to the company. Analysts, though, say co-CEO structure could add complexity to the company's decision-making process. Shares fell by more than 11% today.
Yeah, that was a very diplomatic way of putting it.
What, complexity? Co-CEOs?
Yeah, complexity of a co-CEO.
Yeah, other companies have co-CEOs, right?
That's true.
Yeah, not very good ones. Let's check in on the yield space here because we did actually see yields drop today, modestly to be sure here. But once again, we continue to see these almost, not quite parallel, but near parallel shifts in the curve here. You see there at the long end of the curve, still seeing the most activity with your 30-year yield and that 20-year yield. I believe that is down about 4 basis points.
All right, guys, let's get to some stories that certainly caught our attention. This has to do with insurance executives expecting a U.S. recession to happen in the next 3 years, And what they talked about is an economic slowdown and geopolitical tensions as the 2 issues that pose the greatest macroeconomic threats to their portfolios. Having said that, they're still in on something that we talk a lot about, Tim. Yeah,
private assets. Nearly 2/3 of insurers plan to increase their allocation to private assets, interest in asset-backed finance and senior direct lending strategies. Insurance execs expect private equity to be the best performing asset class over the next 12 months, though most remain optimistic about the S&P 500. The interesting thing here is private equity and the lack of liquidity that you have with private equity. You're supposed to get paid more as a result of that, but that's the quote-unquote patient capital, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like we're all learning about sort of the liquidity and the relative illiquidity of private credit in real time when you take a look at some of these headlines. I will say, though, I did want to shift gears and talk a little bit about Hannah Montana, which feels like quite a departure from what we're hearing from the insurance executives. So this is good news for a certain subset of the population. Hannah Montana's Malibu beach house will be available to rent on Airbnb. I don't know if anyone else on this simulcast was a Hannah Montana or a Miley Cyrus fan, but she had a really, recognizable house, and Airbnb is recreating it as part of a broader anniversary push around the 20th year of the show.
Well, the insurance executive said that was their 3rd thing that they were thinking about over the next 3 to 5 years, about going to the Hannah Montana beach house.
Yeah, as a potential thing that, could avert a recession, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly, right? A little momentum, tourism.
Who stays there?
Probably millennial women.
Okay. Just wondering.
Look at Romaine.
He smiles.
You booked it already, right?
No, I'm not familiar with this. Hannah Montana?
Hannah Montana. Miley Cyrus, she's an icon of what's
Did they ever
generation.
determine who Hannah Montana really was?
It was Miley Cyrus. It was her the whole time.
Oh, so
Well,
the
there's
mystery's been solved.
young Miley
Best of
Cyrus.
both worlds.
So who lived there? Was it Miley Cyrus or Hannah Montana?
Both, actually. You know, Romaine, go on YouTube. You can probably catch, a recap. But
I prefer to watch this.
Right. Okay. Very well.